Okay, so I'm going to talk about the three main tasks that startups need to do. And then I'm going to give some general advice about how to do this. But the nice thing is that these three things are doable. So the first topic that startups need to do is they need to build a product that users love. One of the most important things that we try to teach at Y Combinator is that it's more important to build something that a few users love, than something that a lot of users like. Of course, what you'd like to do is build a startup that a lot of users love, but that's sort of too hard to do as a startup. Otherwise, if that were doable, a big company would do it. So in practice, you always have to choose between building something that a small number of users like, a small number of users love, sort of the intense vertical strategy, or the shallow horizontal strategy of building something that a lot of users like. And now that we've funded 900 startups, we have seen again and again that it's easier to start with something that a few users really love than something that a lot of users really like. It's the same sort of area on the graph, but it turns out to be much easier to expand from that. All of the most successful startups that we funded have started with something that a small number of users love, and they've expanded from there. So this is your first task as a startup, is to build a product that some people love. After you've done that, most startups never get there. Most startups never ever get there. Most startups build something that people like a little bit. They kind of say, yeah, that's okay, but they wouldn't be really bummed if it went away. And the startups that go on to be huge, they have early users that would be really, really disappointed if their product went away. Anyway, after you do that, your next task is to figure out how to grow. And this is the question that we get asked at YC the most. How do I grow? And so here's the answer to this. There are things that work for growth. There are the same 5 things that everyone talks about: advertising, referral programs, like Freddie just announced. You go on and on. There are a lot of things that work for growth, but the thing that works the best for growth is step 1. It's building a product that users really love. If you think about the really big companies, Google, Facebook, companies like that, they didn't have to growth hack. You probably heard about it from a friend, and then you told another friend about it. And we always remind startups that this is the best long-term growth strategy. There are other growth hacks that help things get started, but startups usually have to discover these for the first time. The growth hacks that really work are usually brand new for any given startup. So the second big challenge is to figure out how you're going to grow. And then the third thing that you have to do is figure out how to build a defensible business. So you want a startup idea where if you win, then you're going to stay the winner. It's so hard and it takes so much work to win in the first place. What you really don't want to see happen is you win, you become a large company in a space, and then you're constantly having to fight off competitors. You want something, like Peter Thiel recently called this a monopoly, but you want some network effect or competitive advantage or monopoly such that if you win, you'll remain the winner. And this is so important that it's something to think about when you're first thinking about a startup idea. When someone pitches me a new startup idea that they're thinking about, one of the first questions I ask is this: if you win, will you stay the winner? And the best ideas have answers from the very beginning about why, if they win, they'll stay the winner. And this is one of the most important criteria of a good idea. But anyway, once you figured out how to grow, you want to build this defensible business. And those are really the only 3 things that you have to do. So it's not so hard. Build a product that people love, figure out how to grow it. So for the rest of this, before I go to questions, I want to talk about some tips about how to do all of that. And I want to start by echoing something that Freddie mentioned in his talk, because it's so important to remember, which is that all startups are deeply broken on the inside. One of the things that we tell companies at YC is that it's okay that you have real problems and that you feel like you're an imposter and you feel like you're the only startup with real problems. All startups have problems, and the problems only get bigger. So a lot of founders that are doing those first three things I talked about and on a good path to get them done give up on their startups because they feel like things are broken and that it's unusual that things are broken, and that for most startups things aren't broken. So the first thing to remember is that it's okay that things are screwed up. Unfortunately, things are always going to be screwed up. And if you are successful, you are going to be dealing with problems for the next 10 years. But don't give up because of that. The next thing I want to talk about is about hiring. Team problems are the biggest killer of startups inside of YC. Everyone thinks that startups die at the hands of competitors, but startups commit suicide much more often than startups get killed by somebody else. If you don't have a good team, eventually the startup will implode. And if you do have a great team, the startup will just go on to do better and better things. So there are a number of jobs that the CEO has, but hiring, I think, is the most important. If you don't hire really well, your company will never be a big success. As your company gets bigger and bigger, the only thing the CEO gets to decide on is the company strategy and who the players are, who the people are. Everything else gets done by other people. So you have to hire incredibly well. You have to spend like a third of your time hiring people and recruiting the best people in the world. Even still at YC, this is the biggest part of my job. I can't advise every startup, but I can make sure we get the best partners in the world. And then if you make a mistake hiring, you have to fix it incredibly quickly. Most founders understand that it's important to hire really well, and most founders prioritize that. But it's also important to fire people quickly that aren't sort of A members of the team. And most founders don't understand this, or they understand it, but it's so painful they don't want to do it. One of the things that someone once told me was most impressive about Mark Zuckerberg is not that he hired pretty well, because a lot of founders do that, but that he fired well. And he could fire people quickly that weren't working out. And this is really hard to learn how to do as a founder. The next thing is about spending and frugality. This is probably the next most common cause of death of the startups that we funded. It's really important as a startup to remain frugal. If you don't do this, the culture gets messed up in all sorts of ways. And if the startup spends more money than it makes, then the startup is dependent on the mercy of investors. But if the startup is profitable, because the startup controls costs really well, then the startup is under its own control. So it's really, really important to be as frugal as possible. And many of the best startups that we have ever funded in the early days have taken this to crazy levels. Some people take this a little bit too far. But the best startups are very frugal, and they have a culture in the early days of extreme frugality. And that seems to be really important for success. One thing that I get asked all the time is how I can tell if a startup is going to do well during YC. And my answer to this is a two-part answer, and the two words are focus and intensity. And the best startups are very focused and very intense. In practice, we see the startups about once a week. And the bad startups, when we see them every week, we talk about the same things. And they're talking about all these different plans and making progress on none of them. And so it's the same conversation. It's like Groundhog Day every week. The best startups, though, are incredibly focused on the one or two things that really matter right now, and they do those things incredibly intensely. So we could have a conversation one week. We could agree on the two most important things for the startup to do. And then the next week when we meet again, not only did the startup do those two things, but in the process of figuring that out, of doing those two things, they figured out all of these other new things to do. And they did those as well. And the speed at which the best startups operate is incredible. Bad startups talk about, I'm going to do that next week, I'm going to do that next month. And good startups talk about, I'm going to do that in the next hour, and that other thing in the next 4 hours. And if you think about a startup as sort of successive iteration, and you can get like 5% better every iteration. If every iteration is 4 hours, that compounds really fast. If every iteration is 2 weeks, it compounds much slower. So this is almost a universal observation across the best startups that we funded. They're incredibly focused on a tiny number of things, but the right things, and they do those things very intensely. And so if you look at the week-over-week progress of those startups, they dominate the startups that make a lot of big plans and never get anything done. Let's see, what else do we want to talk about here? I want to talk a little bit about ideas, because most people aren't sure how to have a good idea. So the first thing I want to say about ideas is the only thing that you can't do is create a market that doesn't want to exist. So there's a lot of things that you can change about an idea, but if you're building something that people fundamentally don't want, and you can't make them want it, which you usually can't, that idea is unsalvageable. So the most important thing to remember about ideas is that you cannot create a market that doesn't want to exist. Everything else that you can change. The next thing about ideas is that the best ones are counterintuitive. The very best startup ideas sound bad, but are good. If you imagine a Venn diagram, and here you have sounds like a bad idea, and here you have is a good idea, you want the startup ideas that are right in the middle. The things that are obviously good ideas, the big companies do. The things that sound like bad ideas and are bad are still bad. And the magic area is this thing in the middle. So some of the startups that we funded that have been most successful sounded like a terrible idea. Airbnb, like no one wants to stay on strangers' like couches. And you know, it took some evolution for that idea to get to this idea of renting out the whole apartment. Reddit, you know, like people are going to share links. That sounds like a terrible idea. Dropbox. People used to make fun of Dropbox because they said, oh, Google Drive is going to launch any day and kill Dropbox. You know, this is a terrible idea. But there were a number of insights that Dropbox had, a big one of which is working cross-platform, that made it in fact a good idea. The things that sound like obviously good ideas, I'm always skeptical if I hear something that sounds like an obviously good idea, because it means a lot of people are going to do that, and the competition is going to be brutal. The other thing about ideas is that the founders that we have funded that have been most successful are working on an idea that they themselves understand very well. So they're solving a problem that they have direct personal experience with, because that's how they can really evaluate it. Oh, one last point on ideas. Ignore people telling you your idea is bad. They may be right, but the only way to know is to actually build it out. And I think the thing that works about Silicon Valley that's different than Mexico City or almost anywhere else in the world is the default response. If someone says, hey, I'm going to start a startup, here's my idea, the default response is to be excited and think like, oh, why might that work? And in most of the rest of the world, the default response when you tell someone your idea is to say, oh, that's not going to work. And this is really toxic for startups because you have to believe in yourself. And the good ideas, because they sound like bad ideas, are so fragile and so killable that you have to be really careful to insulate yourself against this. In fact, we don't have a co-working space at Y Combinator. We don't let the startups all work together. They all work in their own office or their own apartment. And part of the reason for this is that ideas are so fragile, and the good ideas sound so bad, that even other startups will often convince you not to work on what would be a great idea. So I've been meeting with Mexican startups for the last couple of days, and the startups have been incredible, really, really great. But I did notice one pattern that I have noticed elsewhere in the world, and I think this is a really important point, so I'd like to make it. You know, the world today is really connected. You can start a startup here and take on the best startups anywhere in the world with a brand new idea, something fundamentally new. And yet what a lot of startups outside of the United States do is say, we're going to be the Uber for Latin America. We're going to be the, you know, like the WhatsApp for the Philippines. We're going to, whatever. You know, we're going to take an idea that's working in the United States and do it better in our local market. And that's okay, that sometimes works, but that's not how the really giant companies get created. What would be better to do, instead of saying we're going to build Uber for Latin America, is to say, you know what, the fundamental idea of Uber is that people need to be able to move easily. And however, Mexico City is very different than San Francisco. And so rather than build the Uber for Mexico City, because I'm an expert in this market, I'm going to think about how to really solve that problem and not build the Uber for Mexico City, but build this totally new thing for Mexico City, which accomplishes the same human need. And if you do that, who knows? You may take on the entire world. You may figure out something better than Uber for everywhere else. But don't constrain yourselves. If I can sort of leave with one piece of advice before we go to Q&A, don't constrain yourselves with thinking that you have to build something that has worked in the US and build a version of that for Latin America. Just build something better than what has worked in the US, and maybe you'll take on the rest of the world by doing that. Also, if you do that, we'd love for you to apply to Y Combinator, or even if you don't, even if you're just thinking about that. We run 2 batches a year, one from June to August, one from January to March. It's only 3 months. You can come to Silicon Valley, you can build up a network and connections there, and then you can come back here. But we'd love to hear from you.